Good afternoon. This is Briefing with the Chief. I'm your host, Patrick Jordan, here on KJRDB.com. You can catch me every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on KJR's Rumble channel, their Facebook page, and their Twitter feed. Now, you can also catch me opining all by myself on Twitter at LAC Jordan. I talk about a whole wide variety of things. And today's show, we're going to talk public policy. We're going to talk why Housing First is failing. And then it's just not going to be me opining. I'm going to bring Dr. Christopher Kelton on from the Independent Institute, and we're going to talk about homelessness, how we got to home housing first as a public policy, why it's failing, and maybe some a direction forward where we should go. Now, as you guys all know, I do have my hand in the homeless issue in Los Angeles, and so this is a topic that interests me. I do sit on the board of the Los Angeles Mission. You can see on the banner there, www.losangelesmission.org. You can check them out and make a donation today. Now, I did serve some meals down there and Thanksgiving, and I went down for Christmas. And I'm waiting for the next event. I'll go and volunteer again. But they do some great work in downtown LA. They do transformative housing. So they bring you in and try to do the best they can to get you off the street and integrate you back in society in a positive way by doing wraparound services, including cognitive behavioral therapy programs, which I think are the gold standard for helping people to change their lives. But we'll get to that in a minute, though. My lead segment, though, I'm going to talk about a couple of issues in my lead segment. And the first is Walter Kurt is... He looked at what Nick Shirley did in Minneapolis, and he decided to go out to Ohio and check out, do they have fraud in the child care, state-funded, government-funded child care system in Ohio? And he did find it. So let's listen to a clip here from Walter Kurt.
When I say that this this organization has received lots of money, I'm not joking. $42 million in federal funding has been sent to the Somalian Education Resource Center over the past 10 years or so, from 2017 till now. And you'll also notice, by the way, that you can see the jump. You see 2017, 2019, they've got some money that are coming in. Then 2020, it's a jump. And then 2021, it is a massive jump, and then a massive jump again. And then in 2025, it is a huge jump. Huge jump. So now they've received over $14 million this year. Okay, so this is a very well-funded organization. Very well-funded. They have lots of money. So the question is, where are they? And that's not an easy question to answer, because if you look them up on Google, it shows that they're permanently closed. That's nice. $14 million and you're permanently closed. I'm not really sure how you do that in a single year. But okay, that's fine. Well, maybe the address is wrong. Well, there's 4 addresses. So you go to address 1, it's the backside of a motel. There's nothing there. You go to address 2, there's something then on a sign that says the Somalian Culture Center, but there's also nothing there, and it looks to be a dentist location. Then you go to another location, and it's a parking lot, and then you go to another location, there's nothing there. So anyway, 4 locations later, we find the Somalian Education Resource Center. It is in a single office at the top of a multi-tenant office building in the very back on the 3rd floor, the final door on the top of the building, all the way in the back. And the only thing that looks expensive about this place is the very high dollar security system that is on the outside door.
So that's Walter Kurt. Now, Walter he's got a show called Political Theater, which I jump on every now and then. You can find it on Spaces on X. And I think we got a banner for that. And here's the thing about, there it is. So you can go to his Substack page, wcdispatch.com/P/the political theater, and you can find him there. And he is going to do a series of visits to check out these locations to see if they actually exist, just like Nick Shirley did in Minneapolis. Now, one of the things that's being said is Trump is frozen the money going to these daycares in these states, and it's, oh my God, they're cutting off the funding for children. When you got a sieve, when you got a hole in your organization and you're bleeding money, you don't keep pouring the money in and try and fix that hole. You stop pouring the money in, fix the hole, and then you turn the spigot on again when you know everything's fixed and you're not losing funds. So that's all that Trump is doing. So Trump's not doing anything wrong. But I dealt with federal grants and federal money, and I have to tell you, they were pretty tight when I was dealing with them. These were Homeland Security grants. It was the tens of millions, not the hundreds of millions and the billions that we're talking about. But they would come and inspect to make sure that we were hitting our timelines, we were hitting our scope of work, that we were doing all the things that we're supposed to be doing. And so it's curious to me, how did we get to a point where we didn't have those systems and controls in place? And, for me, this is an issue of competency. Certainly, Governor Walz, whatever you want to think about him, has demonstrated a lack of competency in protecting the people's money, which is a big obligation for him. If we're going to give people's money out, we need to make sure it's being properly spent. They have no problem having systems and controls in place and making sure you pay your taxes. I think they can put some good systems and controls to make sure that people aren't wasting your money. But check out Walter Kurt at the Political Theater. I will jump on a show every now and then and give commentary on X, and I do like the spaces, so you can catch me on a lot of different spaces. His is one of my favorites. So, also I wanted to talk about another issue. This one's in New York, and this is Mindami, the new mayor of New York, has appointed somebody to be in charge of tenant relations and some of his to deal with his tenant issues in New York. And her name is Shia Weaver, and she has made some comments about public property that is shocking to me. Let's roll with that video.
I think the reality is that for centuries we've really treated property as an individualized good and not a collective good. And we are going to transitioning to treating it as a collective good and towards a model of shared equity will require that we think about it differently. And it will mean that families, especially white families, but some POC families who are homeowners as well, are going to have a different relationship to property than the one that we currently have.
Yeah, just think about that. That is a different relationship with property that we currently have. Like, home ownership, building wealth, building financial independence. It's yours. We fought a war with King George over this called the Revolutionary War. He tried to tax us. We got mad and we fought a war with him. That was property. He's trying to take our property. And here we got now in New York an administration that is talking about taking people's personal property, their houses, away from them so that they could be a shared resource for everybody in the city of New York. And, it's interesting to me because we just took Maduro out of Venezuela. Now, if you remember, I say I'm a student of history. I love history. And it wasn't all that long ago that Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in South America. And then Hugo Chavez came to power through the ballot box. And then he quickly took over as a dictator, and he quickly nationalized the oil industry. And when he didn't have enough oil money, he started nationalizing all the other industries, and he impoverished that nation. When he died of cancer, Maduro took over, and he continued in that vein. And the only people that got rich were the people at the top, Maduro, his friends, and the people that helped him with this corrupt socialist utopia that what they called Venezuela. 90% of the people living in Venezuela today are impoverished. A third of their population left. That is what this kind of nonsense thinking brings you. Now, since she's since backed off some of those comments because there was such huge kickback on what she said. And additionally, some of the other information came out that her mom owns a house in Nashville worth $1.5 billion in a gentrifying neighborhood. Oh my God, another horrifying term, gentrification. But her mom owns a $1.5 million house. Seems like does that mean she's a racist? According to her daughter, that's exactly what it means. So this is nonsense. And I think one of the things that if you follow public policy, one of the things they use to switch the equity calculator for folks is rent control, right? And one of the cities I worked in, the city of West Hollywood, established rent control in the mid 80s. And what it really looked to me over time, because I was there shortly after they established rent control. I worked there for 9 years. I left for 6, and I came back as a lieutenant. And I remember getting this call one night, right? It was this guy, he was complaining about his neighbor. His upstairs neighbor, she obviously worked in the clubs. There's a lot of clubs in the area. It was the entertainment hotspot. And she would come home at like 3 a.m. She'd walk on her upstairs on her floor in high heels, make noise, and he would call almost every night to complain. And finally he got to the lieutenant, right? Complaining that we weren't doing anything about this lady walking in her apartment at night. And, I got to talking to the guy. I go, well, walking in your apartment is not really a violation of any noise rules. If she's not doing anything malicious, just walking in her apartment, There's nothing wrong with that. And I was asking him, and he says, well, I'm a lawyer and I need to get my sleep. And so I asked him, I said, how long have you been there? He says, well, I've been here about 17 years. So he got there shortly after rent control started. He says, I was a young law student and I needed the rent control. I said, well, did you pass the bar? You're now a lawyer. I mean, did you ever consider moving? He goes, well, I have a house. I bought a house years ago, about 15 miles away, but this is close to the office and I want to keep it. And you know what that told me? That rent control stops being about making sure that people who have the least can stay in their apartments, because that's what rent control started at. Elderly people were being priced out of their apartments. They had to leave, right? So it was supposed to help the old people, help the poor people, right? So here this guy gets there, and all it really did, rent control did, in my mind, was switch the value of that property to this renter. Because it was cheap, he could keep it as a second residence close to his office. Well, he has this big house somewhere else that he drove to on the weekends or when he wanted to see his wife or family, whatever. And the worst thing about it was his complaint. The lady upstairs is making a lot of noise. Now, she moved in way after him, which means, because what happens with rent control, as the house is vacated, it goes back to market rate. So she's paying a ton more for her apartment than he is, because he was in there on the beginning. He's getting the value of the increased housing costs, because he doesn't have to pay the increased housing costs to keep that apartment. That equity is transferred to him alone. Nobody's got the equity ruler out for this lawyer who doesn't need that apartment, that rent controlled apartment. And that happens all the time in these programs. Corruption and fraud creeps in. That's why just let the market handle it. Let's not do rent control. Let's not do the crazy things that they want to do in New York. And let's not take people's property away from them. Let the market do it. Build some homes, reduce regulation. Let's build some homes. And we're probably going to get into a little of that with my guests, because we're going to talk about homelessness and the causal factors for it. But I have to send my prayers and thoughts over to the New Yorkers, given that these are the kind of people they're putting in charge in New York City. But let's bring up our guest, and we'll let him talk a little bit. This is Dr. Christopher Kelton from the Independent Institute. I always let my guests talk about my lead segment. I'm sure you got some comments about rent control and taking people's equity away from them property. Well, what do you think?
Well, rent control's always been a disaster. This is nothing new. This is what drives me crazy about these leftist policies is they try, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that's exactly what they do. Rent control is not a new policy. I'm a historian, right? We can look back at history, say, what was the effect of it in the past? Did it work, or did it have negative unintended consequences? And every single time it did, right? Rents go up under rent control because, as you said, when people vacate, rents go back to market rates. And those market rates are now higher because people aren't building new apartments as much because of the rent control laws, right? So we're increasing scarcity. And so when they do get to adjust, they adjust by larger margins, they adjust upwards. So you do have a small group of beneficiaries who benefit that. And even that's a minor benefit in many cases, because landlords start neglecting the properties because they're still trying to eke out a profit when they can't raise rents as they need to. They still have maintenance costs. In the 70s, we saw this. It was I can't remember what year it was, but there was a famous World Series, I think in the late 70s, where there was an aerial shot of the stadium, Yankees or Mets, whichever one it was. And you could see a building burning in the background. It was an apartment building. And this was taking place commonly there because of New York's rent control laws, where landlords were committing arson on their buildings for the insurance money because they were losing their shirts on these rent control policies because they couldn't raise rents and they still had to harbor all of these costs for maintaining their buildings, right? So it's always been a disaster. There was actually an economist around the same time, I can't remember the name of him, but in the 70s, who took pictures of cities that had been bombed during a war and took pictures of cities that had rent control policies and put them side by side and would ask his students to pick out which one was which. And you couldn't tell, right? Because they were just so destroyed by these policies, the neglect that rent control forces on landlords. So they've always been a disaster.
Yeah, I think in my example, so here, there's not even a means test, right? So, I mean, if you want to help people who have the least and let them have controlled rents, in my example, when the guy was a young student, all right, maybe he needed a little rent control. But, now that he's a practicing attorney, he's making money, he's got a house somewhere else. Why does he get to stay in a rent-controlled apartment? So you don't even have a means test to it, right? He gets to keep the equity increase by staying there, right? He gets to hold the value of the increase. He's in a neighborhood that people want to be in because it's the entertainment area. He wants to keep it there. He wants nobody to make any noise around him, right? He controls all of that. He could just leave, but no, I can't give up my rent-controlled apartment because I'm entitled to it. That's the other thing that bothers me about people in rent control. I'm entitled to this. This is mine. And that is the same attitude that they're fighting against with landlords. Well, you're not entitled to more money, right? And yet they're entitled to the equity of that property, right? That just drives me crazy. What do you think?
And you mentioned the corruption too. One other story I like to tell about rent control is Charlie Rangel, Representative Charlie Rangel in New York, would use a rent controlled apartment as his office, right? So this absolutely gets captured by corruption. Their abused policies. Argentina, after Milei took office, they did away with rent control and rents dropped precipitously, right? So we see both effects. Rent control absolutely has the opposite effect of its intentions. Yeah. And that's what Milton Friedman said. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is to judge policies by their intentions rather than their effects. When we judge rent control by its effects, you can't support it. It's no good coming.
I love Milton Friedman. I knew this would be a fun discussion. Yeah, it creates scarcity is what it does, right? What's the incentive for building more units?
Artificial scarcity.
Artificial scarcity, and then they have to force builders to develop low-income housing. If you want to build this luxury one, you have to build 10 units that are low. So we do all these stupid policies that just exacerbate the problem. But hey, we're here to talk about homelessness, and before we get into this, I want people to understand. I'm a fan of the Independent Institute. And I want to give you a chance to talk about the institute where you work at. You're a fellow there, right? And you're a doctor, so a good doctor, PhD. And explain the Independent Institute and what you guys do.
Right. So we are a think tank devoted to peace and prosperity. I often describe us classically liberal. We're free market, anti-war is usually the explanation I give to people. That's not our official elevator pitch, but I think that summarizes kind of where we stand on most issues. So we can, we're opposed to foreign interventions and foreign conflicts. We strongly favor private property rights, free trade, and very nonpartisan. You look at our stuff, you're going to find stuff critical of Republicans and Democrat policies, right? We don't favor one side or the other. We stand by our principles, and so you will find that from us very, very, very consistently.
Well, I've read several of your policy positions, not yours in particular, but the institute position, and I agree. I disagreed with your opinion on automated license plate reader. There's probably another guy that wrote that article because I'm a fan
Jonathan
of it. If it's done right, and I was a big fan of that, and I would love to use that technology to make LA safer, but a lot of people are getting in the way of that. I'm out of the business now. I'm retired, but that I just saw it as a possibility. I traveled to London, saw it. But I think you can put controls in place to make it a little better. But then on this one, on homelessness and I think the drug laws, I think I read some articles about that as well. I probably line a lot closer with you, particularly on this housing first stuff, because I've seen how it hasn't worked. So I read your article and I said, I got to interview this guy. So let's give a little bit of your background and then we'll get into, so tell us about Dr. Christopher Kelton. Did I say it right? Is it Calton or Colton?
It is Kelton. Nobody ever says it that way, but that's how I pronounce it. So you're, okay. I think, the first person outside of my family to do that without me telling them. But yes, Calton is how we pronounce it. Everybody else pronounce it Calton. I don't usually correct them. We get Carlton sometimes in the South, which is where I grew up. Carlton is common, so I'll correct that. But yeah, so my PhD is in history. I actually studied business history, or what we call history of capitalism now. But I studied under an old school, like 90s era business historian. And so that's kind of how I like to identify. Homelessness was a bit of a shift for me when I took this job, but I've dived into it for the past few years now. And that's my role at housing and homelessness. I do have a pretty strong economic background, even though it wasn't one of my fields. I spent a lot of time studying that as research fellows, like summer research fellows during grad school at economic organizations organization, so I have a pretty strong grasp of economics as well. So I try to bring these insights in there, historical and economic perspective on these issues. And particularly with homelessness, the historical perspective is not very well fleshed out. History is hard to write about things that you don't have good documentation for, like homelessness. We didn't really have homelessness policy until the 80s. So I'm actually working on a book on the history of homelessness, trying to explain how we got to modern homelessness of the 1980s to the present, which is very different than historic homelessness, right? Homelessness before the 80s or late 70s usually didn't mean people living outside of a roof. It meant young single men that paid for an SRO hotel for $1 a day. They were homeless because they were disaffiliated. They didn't have community connections or anything like that, but they actually paid for room and board and had a place to live, and most of them worked. Very few people that were classified as homeless lived on the streets. They were usually heroin addicts, who Nels Anderson, an old homelessness expert in the 1920s, said they couldn't be away from their dealers. I think about that a lot because I think that explains San Francisco a great deal. These guys that deny housing, decline housing, or live on the streets even when they have it. But aside from that, before the late 70s or the 80s, homelessness really, it wasn't a category of population. It was just a status of young, single, mostly white men that just weren't part of a community, essentially. And then by the 80s, it's the mental illness, drug addiction, people living on the streets, like actually on the streets in large numbers. It became something new. So I'm working on that history, and I don't think anybody else has ever really tackled that problem because it's hard to write about from a historical perspective.
There's a book out of the Manhattan Institute. I don't know if I forget the name of it.
Yes, Stephen Idey's Homelessness in America, I believe.
I think I'm probably about 80% through that. So I when you talk about SROs, and I understand what you're talking about, hobos, bums, and he has different names for it too. So I think that's the only one that I've ever seen that has kind of has taken a historical approach to it when he talks about how we got here and where we are today. But we are talking about you guys. Let's throw the banner for the Independent Institute. Let's do a little advertisement for them, and let's talk about the book that you contributed to, which talks about how Housing First has failed, and that is Beyond Homelessness, Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes, and Transformative Solutions, which will probably dominate what we're going to be talking about here for the rest of the hour. And here it is right here. You can see it. There's the title name. You can go right to the Independent Institute and buy the book there. I'm sure you can get it on Amazon as well. And I've read the summary, and we're going to get into it right now. So you contributed to this book. You're not the author, but you contributed heavily to the book. Is that correct, Dr.?
Yeah, I'm a contributing author. Yeah, it was edited work with several authors.
Okay, so let's talk about Housing First. I think the audience needs to know, what is Housing First, and how did we embrace this as a policy in the U.S. today?
Housing First is the idea that to help the homeless, you give them immediate housing with no strings attached, right? And so this contrasts to you were calling it something different. I call it usually housing readiness, sometimes the linear model, staircase model. It goes by many names, but housing readiness is the one we use in the book, which was the idea that we're going to have a series of housing solutions that include like sobriety and service requirements, service participation requirements to help you become independent and self-sustaining. This was actually developed in the Clinton era, right? So this was a Clinton administration kind of idea that was made federal policy in, I think, 1994. And we don't have good historic data on homelessness numbers going back that far. We only have it starting in 2007. Before then, it's spotty data, so it's hard to judge the historical success. But the few years that we have data of before we switched to Housing First, Housing Readiness did show a decline in overall homelessness, a gradual decline year after year in those years that we have data for. But in 2009 was when we officially made the shift, or 2013. You can give different dates. 2009 with the Hearth Act, signed by President Obama, started our shift to Housing First. It kind of started with George W. Bush, who shifted HUD's thinking toward Housing First. Then the Hearth Act in 2009, and then in 2013, it was kind of, the transition was complete because HUD stopped giving grants to anything that did not comply with the Housing First guidelines. And the big shift between Housing Readiness and Housing First was sobriety requirements and service participation, right? So under Housing Readiness, you would start with like emergency shelter very temporarily. Then you would go into transitional housing where you would stay for a few months or a few years. And you would participate in like work training programs to help you become employable and find a job, sobriety programs to help you get off drugs if you were on drugs, other things, there are different things. Some of them might be parenting programs to help you, restore your family. Yeah. And you would graduate, right? And so this is why sometimes it's called the staircase model. And the goal was to eventually get you to where you had your own housing that wasn't paid for by the taxpayer, where you were a productive member of society, where you were living independent, and where you could sustain yourself. And that worked for between a third and maybe a little more than a third of the people who went through these programs. But what was very important is because we were using these resources efficiently, we weren't sustaining people for their entire life, we could help a wider pool of people. So when we switched to housing first, the idea was, okay, we're going to replace transitional housing with rapid rehousing. And the main difference between the two is rapid rehousing doesn't have any of the program requirements. And then people are going to get into permanent supporting housing when it becomes available. And permanent supporting housing is permanently subsidized housing, right? With no sobriety requirements or service participation. So the goal of independence and self-sustaining lifestyle, that's thrown out. It says, we're impossible. We're going to make you permanent wards of the state. And so what happens is instead of using the resources that we devote to homelessness to help to cast as wide a net as possible, we have a small group of beneficiaries that dominate the resources, which is ironic because that was the argument in favor of housing first, is you had a small group of people. This was Malcolm Gladwell's 2006 article advocating housing first called $1 Million Murray. He said people like Murray Barr, who ran up a hospital bill of $1 million over a decade. This is a small group of homelessness dominating resources. And so we need housing first to end this. Well, housing first has actually perpetuated it even more so because now there's permanent supportive housing only reaches a small percentage of the homeless population. There's not enough of it to go around and they're permanently subsidized. So all these resources are being tied up in this small group of people. And so the people that get it have a higher rate of staying stably housed, which is the new goal under Housing First. It's no longer independence. Now it's housing stability. So within the group of beneficiaries, they have a higher rate of housing stability, but they're not able to help but a small fraction of people who experience homelessness. In San Francisco, the budget for homelessness is something around $750 million a year. And more than half of that is spent subsidizing the living of people that are no longer counted as homeless because they're in permanent supportive housing. You're not counted as homeless if you're in rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. So the lion's share of homelessness spending goes sustaining these permanent wards of the state while other people get neglected. And the problem with this is really dystopian, right? Because Housing First is supposed to focus on the chronically homeless. So one of the pillars of Housing First is we want to focus on the most desperate cases, which sounds nice in theory, but in practice, it's really creepy because what they have to do to negotiate who gets help and who doesn't is hand people vulnerability assessment tests. So you go up to a homeless person that wants help and needs help, and you give them a questionnaire to see how desperate their situation is. And if it's not desperate enough, they don't get help at all. So instead of helping the chronically homeless, you're actually creating more because people that could get out of it more easily with some help have to suffer until their condition deteriorates. The worst example of this I ever heard of was a woman in Portland who was denied housing repeatedly until she lost both of her legs to frostbite and became a double amputee. And then she got housing because now she passed the vulnerability assessment test, right? So it's extremely dystopian and it has failed by every measure. It has not helped reduce homelessness, has not helped reduce chronic homelessness. Every measure it has failed.
And we got to get into why. Okay, so what was the studies or what was the evidence base? Because we've talked about this. What is the evidence that said Housing First would even work in the first place? Why did we get this policy? Because I think as a public policy implementation guy, I saw this as a train wreck when I was being forced to identify using jail information the top 5 and 10% utilizers in LA County, right? That we were looking at all our databases, and the sheriff's department and the jails were one of the big ones in terms of cost. So I ran the data stuff. So I said, this isn't right because the most difficult ones are the hardest ones to address. We should be doing the easy one first, just because it's a low-hanging fruit. I mean, to me, that's a public policy, common sense thing. But what was the evidence that showed that this would work, and how do we get this as a policy beyond just Obama passing a law.
Sure. So Housing First originated in New York in an organization called Pathways to Housing ran by a man named Samson Barris. And he published a case study in 1999 where he recognized that the housing readiness programs, and while I will, as a small aside, say that the housing readiness as federal policy did have its own problems because it did neglect people who couldn't be expected to achieve independence, namely the mentally ill. People that were a product of deinstitutionalization in the 60s and 70s, the schizophrenics, people with extreme bipolar disorder that couldn't sustain a job, that are more prone to addiction because people with mental illness are much more likely to develop substance abuse problems, right? These people, so there is a portion of the homeless population which dominates what we see as the unsheltered homeless, the people in these tent encampments, who may not, in many cases, cannot be expected reasonably to become self-sustaining. And housing readiness left them by the wayside. And Samson Barris recognized this. And so he started a program where he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just give them housing with no strings attached and see if they can remain stably housed. But he focused specifically on people with a diagnosed mental illness. And that's really key. This case study was not looking at the whole homeless population. He was looking at the people who were left by the wayside under housing readiness, specifically the mentally ill. And what he found is they had a higher rate of housing stability when you permanently subsidized their housing, right? And so it was a success when it was used as a complementary program alongside housing readiness, which is how it originally operated, right? So when it was supplementary, it did work. I do think there's a place for these kind of programs for, you have to do something with the severely mentally ill that can't care for themselves, right? You can't expect them to get a job and lead a normal life. It's a sad truth, but we don't have a cure for schizophrenia, which was like 80% of the deinstitutionalized population. So we do have to deal with that. And so it looked like the success rate. And so what he showed is by shifting the goalpost from independence to housing stability, the success rate went from something like 37%, I don't remember the exact numbers, to something like 87%, right? A lower bar, but higher success rate within that population of the mentally ill. And so when people say this is an evidence-based approach, that's what they're referring to. These case studies that ignore the total population and look only at the beneficiaries. If you only look at the beneficiaries, Housing First looks more successful. And that works fine if we're talking about an independent organization. But when we're talking about national policy, we have to look at the aggregated data, right? The entire population. And when we look at that under Housing First, what we find is the trend in homelessness was going down until we switched to Housing First, and then it started spiking upwards. And homelessness spending also skyrocketed, which is a very important point. So homelessness and homelessness spending have skyrocketed since we've adopted Housing First. And that's because this is not a good program for people who can potentially achieve independence. It's a horrible program for them, right? So we switched to this one-size-fits-all policy instead of making it supplementary to housing readiness. It's now a one-size-fits-all policy that even people that just have an addiction problem or are just down on their luck, but aren't, like severe schizophrenics or something like that, they're still just expected to deteriorate until they're beyond the point of no return, and then they're going to be made permanent wards of the state or they're going to die. And that's what we find, right?
Yeah, when I was the chief of the police for the LA Metro here, so it would be similar to like New York system. I ran the policing and security for the LA Metro, and we had homeless on the system, and we recognized that we had severely mentally ill, and then people who were capable, and then people who were just using it because maybe it was too hot or too cold outside, right? So right. I understand that dynamic, but here's one of the things that I guess I wanted. So they focused on one group, and then they expanded, as is usual. It happens they expanded it to a bunch of other groups, not recognizing or ignoring the fact that it may not have been the right program for them. Right. Who is the right group? You would say the right group for Housing First is probably those people who I'll just use the terminology they use, fell into homelessness because of economic issues, but generally they're a functioning societal member, but they're struggling, right? That would be a good use. Homeless First would be good policy for that group, right?
Well, I think compared to them living on the streets, yes, I don't necessarily think that that's the best policy for them. I think we need to revisit commitment laws, involuntary commitment laws, and make it a little easier to have people committed for long-term stays in psychiatric hospitals. And this is a controversial position because a lot of the horror stories around psychiatric hospitals, there was some exaggeration to it, but there was also some truth to it. Like psychiatric hospitals were never like the nicest places to live. But when it's all about comparative analysis, right? When we compare different options, that still seems to be the least bad, right? Because what we're dealing with is the majority of these people had schizophrenia. Others had severe mood disorders, and then a few had what they call organic brain diseases, which aren't as common because a lot of that was neurosyphilis, which now we have penicillin, so we don't see that as much as we used to. But the schizophrenia was the bread and butter of psychiatric hospitals, and it's very common among the unsheltered homeless, and then severe bipolar disorder is another one. That's what we're dealing with. We don't have cures for these things. There's no solution to them that's going to give us butterflies in our stomach, right? But we got to do living on the streets, where they become addicted to drugs, where they're not on medication, where they don't see doctors, where they can't take care of themselves, where they're, mentally ill people are a little bit more likely to commit violent crimes. That there is, most of them don't, but they do have a higher propensity to than the average population. But they are significantly likely to be victims of violent crimes. So leaving them on the streets is a horribly inhumane position. And so then the question is housing first or is institutionalization better? I tend to think institutionalization is better because there's story after story of these people when they are institutionalized for brief stays. I was just writing about a famous one in the 80s and 90s, Larry Hogue, the wild man on 96th Street. They said when he would be briefly institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital, he would be put on meds and he would be calm, he'd be amiable, he's a great person, everybody loved him. And then when he was released, because they couldn't hold him, once he was no longer a danger to himself, they couldn't hold him, he'd go off his med, he would start smoking crack, he was a crack addict, and he was violent, he was dangerous, he pushed a woman in front of a bus, he would threaten people with a baseball bat spiked with nails, right? And this, what we see. So if we have housing first for that person, we still aren't enforcing that they're on their meds, right? We're still not stopping them from overdosing in drugs, which is like 30%, I think, of the overdoses in San Francisco are people in permanent supportive housing, right? So it's not, I think, the best solution.
I think I asked the question wrong. So is there a group of people that housing first works for? And I'm thinking those are people who are not mentally ill, not really addicted, but are just struggling with finances, that they get help with shelter until they can get a better job or get a job, right? So is there a group of people that can be helped by housing first, in your mind?
That's a tough question to answer, because in the sense you say, well, yeah, if you're not addicted to drugs, if you're not mentally ill, then maybe yes. The problem is when it's a one size fits all policy, you don't even have room for sobriety requirements. You take the family of four that's down on their luck that might benefit from the subsidized housing, and you're placing them in a crack den, essentially, or a fentanyl den now, and they're surrounded by drug dealers and prostitutes, and there's no room to get out of that under housing first, especially in California, where housing first law is much worse than the federal law, because you're not even allowed to encourage people to get into recovery or you'll lose your funding. Federal law, you can still encourage people to enter treatment, but not under state law in California. So maybe in a different formula there could be, but I don't think so. I think housing readiness just works. If you're not mentally ill, housing readiness seems to just produce better results.
Okay, so let's get into, all right, so housing, the way I talk about it is, as I'm dealing with housing and public policy, is we're driven by a very narrow selection of options for housing with housing first, and we really need to expand those options if we're going to be successful, because it's as you say in the book, homelessness is a complex issue. There's a variety of reasons why people end up homeless. They could be a variety of joint issues. They could be mentally ill and addicted, right? Or they could just be mentally ill, or they could just deal with addiction problems. Or, one of the studies I read that 7% of the people ending up in homeless in LA County was that it was because of domestic violence. So there's a lot of different reasons that cause them to be homeless. And it's really, you have to target those causal factors to be successful. And housing first doesn't really do that. As you say, one size fits all, right? So if you could wave your magic wand, and what would be some of the strategies you would use to deal, let's say with addiction? You have somebody who's homeless, they're addicted either to alcohol or drugs. What would be a strategy you would use to get them off the street? What would be the responsible way to do that?
Well, the first thing is you just need more treatment beds, right? There are many people in California who actually would have sought treatment and have been denied it because there aren't enough treatment beds for all the people struggling with substance abuse in California. So, and that's a really important thing to understand is there are more people that want treatment for addiction in California than there are available treatment beds. That should never be the case, right? So you need more treatment beds. If it's not, it's just like with housing, right? With, you want to get people off the streets, you need more housing, right? That's one of the components. Well, it's the same thing with treatment beds for people with substance abuse is you need to have enough to supply the population's needs. And you don't have that with treatment beds now. Other programs that I think are helpful are diversion programs. These drug diversion programs or jail diversion programs, you'll hear them called different times, where if you're arrested for some offense and you face jail time, the judge might say, okay, well, you have an option of going to prison or you can go into treatment voluntarily. Most of the people I know through my work who are recovering drug addicts who are formerly homeless got clean through diversion programs. Like that is a very successful approach. Now, the proviso in progressive areas is you can't extend this to violent crimes, right? Because the left-wing narrative is often that crime is environmentally determined, it's social structures and all this stuff, poverty. And there's some truth in that if we're looking at property crime, but if we look at violent crime, it doesn't hold up. So you can't extend that to violent crime. I think there might be some room to do it for property crime. I think there's absolutely room to do it for drug crimes, like if you're arrested for possession. But diversion programs do have good success rate. They're better than compulsory treatment. Compulsory treatment has the lowest success rate. This is where you just say, we're going to arrest you and force you to go into treatment. This is what in academic literature, they distinguish as, instead of compulsory, coercive treatment, where we're giving you the option between prison. And it doesn't sound like much like a distinction without a difference, I think, to a lot of people. But psychologically, it's very powerful because it gives them a sense of agency over their decision. And in doing so, it gives them more buy-in and we see higher success rates. So diversion programs work very, very well.
Yeah, as I told you in the green room before we started, one of my last projects was a rapid diversion program in Skid Row in LA. And it was a bunch of us, it was the public defender's office, it was alternate public defender's office, and MacArthur Foundation was involved. And the sheriff's department was involved, which is what I represented. And then we had public health, mental health were involved. So we put it all together. And they had somebody from the MacArthur Foundation helping to do the policy shaping and stuff like that. But it was really driven by the public defender's office. And if you got a ticket on Skid Row from LAPD, because they had that area, and it was the LA city attorney was also involved, you could go to the local court and they would do a mental health assessment and that you would be offered. Do you want to go to jail or do you want to try a program? It's exactly what you're talking about. And one of the reasons why I felt that was successful is right, because the person had the option, as you called it, agency, right? The person had the option. And there's also a little bit of a hook. Even though all these guys had been in jail before, they're not afraid of jail. Many said no, because they said a week in jail because of overcrowding. I'd rather do that than get sober, right?
Sure.
But some of them said yes, and we got a 92% success rate. And so for me, that differs from Housing First, right? Because you're laying out an expectation from them, right? And many of them were successful. And one of the shortcomings that we have, because I just want to reinforce what you said, is finding a bed for them, a treatment bed. That was our biggest struggle, and finding a treatment bed that would be flexible, because the shortage of treatment bed meant that they could pick and choose who they wanted in their program, which is another thing, right? Scarcity, I get to just cherry pick who I'm going to have in my program, right? So we had a lot of these things to overcome, and I'm glad to say it's been successful. So it reinforces exactly what you're talking about. But let's talk about mental health. So you talk about, now we got Care First model here, which I think is a very weak version of where we try to commit people. I think the governor just threw something out there, but it really does. It seems to me it's the care courts doesn't necessarily give the strongest hook to get people to commit people, right? I think it's kind of weak, but it's at least a nod that is an approach. So you're talking with let's say the third of the people on the street who are mentally ill, seriously mentally ill, because there are some people who are mentally ill. I got to clarify this. There are some people mentally ill who know what they're doing. They have some mental illness, but mental
illness is often episodic.
Yeah. Well, yes. And but we're talking about the severely mentally ill who you can't expect for them to have form intent, and they're which is how we determine criminality, and we can't expect, they're gravely disabled, right? And that's what we're talking about, right? So this is the group that you're talking about, some level of commitment, right? And how would you shape that policy if we got to that policy? How would you want to do that? Would that be law enforcement intervention, court intervention, family intervention? How do we get there? Or do you say all of the above in terms of intervention, just doing the assessment?
I think the first thing, so I will mention, no matter what a state does to make it easier to commit a person, they have a federal barrier in the form of a Supreme Court ruling in the 70s that basically made it nearly impossible to involuntarily commit somebody for long periods of time. So even if a state passes the perfect law without some overturning of that precedent in that court case, you're going to face legal challenges. There was an attempt to do this in the 90s in New York with a woman who went by the Joyce Brown, I think was her name, but she went by the name Billy Boggs, famous homeless person in the 80s, not the 90s. And they had a team that would go out and find the mentally ill and try to take them to a psychiatric hospital. She was the first one they picked up. And the ACLU or somebody like one of these organizations, civil liberties organizations, immediately took her case and got it thrown out. The program was shut down pretty quickly in New York, right? So you face these legal challenges at the federal level because of this court case from the 70s. So until and unless that's overcome, we're going to face challenges with recommitting people who need it. Beyond that, I think the biggest thing is just making it easier for families and guardians to have people committed, right? That doesn't always lead to perfect outcomes. You do hear these horror stories. The story that was involved in the case that led this was in Florida State Hospital, where my mom used to work, actually. Somebody who seemed maybe accurately should not have been committed, maybe wasn't mentally ill, but was committed by his father. But these were rare cases, right? And so most of the time, the family is going to be the people best positioned to make that call. I think more than law enforcement, more than social workers, even more than doctors, I think the family is going to be in the best position to make that call, because more often than not, family has your best interest in mind more than any of these other actors, right? More than the police. Not that the police don't care, but they're not your family. They're not your parents or your spouse, right? So I think that's the biggest thing, is if we can overcome the federal precedent, then just making it easier for families and guardians, that would immediately significantly reduce the people in this situation living on the streets.
Yeah, I will add to that. I when I was running the LA County Jail System program, so I did the program, treatment programs, whatever, educational programs to reduce recidivism. We had a lot of mentally ill. A third of our population was mentally ill in LA County. So we're talking, God, it was like 3,500 to 4,000 people, some severely mentally ill. And we were just stabilizing when I first got involved, and they got rid of those folks who were in charge, and they started actual treatment. And I wrote a strategic plan for homelessness in LA County and how we should use that as an opportunity, that they're starting their treatment. So we need to bridge them to treatment on the outside. And we need to do this continuous treatment for them as they touch the criminal justice system. I didn't get anywhere because my sheriff was fighting with the Board of Supervisors, and the funding was not going to come to the Sheriff's Department to develop any new programs. But I really felt we end up with a lot of mentally ill people in the jails, and we could start treatment there and then use that to leverage treatment through mental health courts or some other way. And get voluntary commitments from folks when they're sober and they've been medicated, and maybe we'll get some luck there. But I just don't see that happening in LA at this time, or at least it wasn't happening a few years ago when I was in charge. But we gotta talk a little bit about. I had all these little things I was going to show just to spur the conversation, but I'm not having any problem with this conversation. So let's get into. We got to talk about the waste of housing first. How much are we wasting with this program that's not working? And we got 5 minutes left. And how much? And let's talk about the homeless industrial complex, which you coined in your article, or at least in the book. It's in there. Can talk about those two issues. How much are we wasting, and how has it fostered this homeless industrial complex?
How much waste is going on is always a hard question to answer because the answer is usually more than we realize. So the state audit that came out, a year ago, I think said over 5 years, California spent $24 billion on homelessness and hasn't tracked outcomes, right? How much of that is waste? Not tracking outcomes doesn't mean that it all went to waste, right? We don't have the outcomes. That's the point, right? But I think we can suspect that it's pretty wasted. California is not on the homelessness front exactly, right? 2/3 of the homeless population is unsheltered in California, for God's sake. So my position is all of it's wasted, right? Like it's not doing it. If it's not working, it's all wasted, right? The public money, right? Private money's not wasted. Where these, like Union Rescue Mission we were talking about before the show, right? It's not wasted in places like that where they're actually helping people, land on their feet. But the government money, it all seems to be wasted just by the measure of the growth in homelessness, right? So waste is enormous, and there's tons of corruption. There was a story corruption in the homeless industrial complex is organization. Like there was one that was paid more than $100 for each meal it fed a homeless person, and all they were feeding them was instant noodles, right? So they're just pocketing this money. These people are paid several $100,000 a year, or more, and barely any of that actually reaches the homeless. And most of what does is just these permanent subsidies for permanent supportive housing, where people die in high numbers from drug overdose, right? So to me, it's all wasted. Every penny of it's wasted of the public money, right? Because if you're not spending it well, it's not just fraud and corruption. If you're spending it on misguided policies, it's going to waste, and that's what we're doing with Housing First.
Yeah, and so you have to have key performance indicators if you're spending, and it's not like the state doesn't know that. We're talking about California for our audience, this national, they spent $24 billion and we're not getting a good outcome, and the Democrats know it, and they genuflect. I know you guys are nonpartisan, but I got to throw this out there. One of their own lawmakers says, hey, we are spending on the right issue, homelessness, but we're not getting outcomes. And this was a couple years ago, he said this. And I think a lot of policymakers know that, but they're loath to admit it because it would hurt them politically, right? And we got to get past that. I remember when I was working, said, well, you're showing us bad information. I go, yeah, I know. We got some room to improve, but we're not going to improve if we're not willing to talk about things not working, right? Okay, we got 90 seconds. This was a great show. We just blasted.
It went by quickly.
It went by quickly. So let's talk about what do you got coming up, Dr. Kelton? What do you got coming up? What can we look out for in terms of writing and what's going on at Independent Institute? Sell yourself, sell your institute.
I recently published a report. This isn't coming up, but this is recently published a report on NIMBYism, not in anybody's backyard. You can find it for a free download on the website. This is about the NIMBY phenomena in California, the history of it, the outcomes. It's almost kind of comical to read some of these absurd examples in California of people blocking housing for the stupidest reasons. So that's a recent thing. My current big project is a book on the history of homelessness, but that won't be out for a while. It's still very much in the drafting phase.
Well, I'll be looking forward to that. As I said, I'm almost through the Manhattan Institute guy. His book is wow, it's really dense. That's what I got into it. It's
I wrote a review of it. Yeah.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm probably try to get him on down the road here once I get through that book. And when I'll be looking for your book as well, and I'll probably read that as well. This is I think one of the most important issues of the day, and I think we're handling poorly as a public policy issue. And I think one of the reasons why we're handling poorly is we've narrowed our options to just what some people have accepted as politically correct for them, and we got to stop doing that on public policy. There's no correct way, particularly with homelessness, because there are a variety of different ways that lead you to homelessness. But Doctor, hey, thank you for coming on my show, Briefing with the Chief. I'd love to have you back. I hope this was a good experience for you.
It was, yes, enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right, folks, this is Briefing with the Chief, Dr. Christopher Calton. You can find him at the Independent Institute. Go and check out his work there and all the great work of the Independent Institute. And you can catch me next week on Briefing with the Chief, like I said, KJDB.com, every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And thank you, folks. Amanda, you can take it away. Doc, stick around for a quick debrief.